Welcome to the Coping Podcast, where we share strategies for coping with the stressors of life, especially the difficulties of parenting. And here is your host, Dr. Lee Weiss.
This is Dr. Lee Weiss. I am the host of the Coping Podcast, where I feature top experts on topics like raising healthy children, parenting, and so much more. Past guests include therapists Dr. Aaron Fromm and Ben Kessler, confidence coach Leslie Randolph, dietitian Lara Field, and many more. Just a quick disclaimer, the information provided is for educational and informational purposes only. This is not intended to provide mental health treatment and does not constitute a client-therapist relationship. The information provided is not a replacement for being assessed and evaluated by a licensed professional and is not intended to replace mental health or medical advice. Before we dive into today's topic, I wanted to introduce today's guest, who is a family law attorney and partner at the esteemed family law firm Beermann. Beth does both litigation and alternative dispute resolution. In litigation, she represents children. She helps her clients determine whether litigation, mediation, or collaborative law is the most appropriate process for their family. The guiding philosophy under which Beth practices is founded on compassion and empathy. When going through a divorce, Beth understands that people are often scared and vulnerable. She believes some battles should be fought in court and others should not. Her email, if you'd like to speak with her directly, is B for Beth McCormack, spelled MCCORMACK at beermannlaw.com, BEERMANN law.com. So thank you so much, Beth, for taking the time to be here with us today. I've learned so much from you when you hosted a collaborative meeting, a monthly meeting for both family lawyers and therapists. You've always been so helpful and spend inordinate time to make sure you're doing right for your clients and also sharing your knowledge of the family law with me and other clinicians to make sure we're doing the best that we can. So for our audience, I would say often we get clients who are starting the divorce process. And I'm wondering if you can educate us a little bit about the different roles that attorneys might have in representing children.
Oh, sure. Thanks for having me, Lee. The term GAL is the most common that people may have heard of. It's the Latin phrase guardian ad litem. And what we're doing in that role in locally in the Chicagoland area is acting as the advocate for the child, looking out for the child's best interest, to be specific. So this is a somewhat confusing role that many lawyers don't understand, much less the public. But it's very important that people have a basic understanding that a GAL is only looking out for the child's best interest. The GAL is a witness to the court. So they'll be called to testify just like the litigants, the parties, the people who are getting divorced, and any other witnesses. They're subject to cross-examination by the lawyers, etc. And that role is very distinct from the role of child representative, where you act as an attorney. So as an attorney, you're calling witnesses yourself. You're acting as an advocate, which is very, very different than just looking at the child's best interest. So if you think of it from the standpoint of a teenager, I always like to use that as the example. A teenager has a voice, but a child's representative is balancing the role of being a lawyer and advocating for what the child wants and what's in the child's best interest. And you can see when that's a teenager, how challenging that can be, because the teenager might say, I want to live with mom, and the rationale for it might not be in their best interest. And I'm not picking on moms. The example I often give is, the offer of the shiny red car if you go live with dad. So we try to be really careful to look at their best interest while also advocating for what they want. Mm-hmm. I have stories of, meeting with children who they're children, but they're, let's say 15, 16, or maybe pre-adolescent, where they say, I have a lawyer, and they try to use that against their parents for things that obviously aren't related to the divorce, like curfews and screen time. And,
Right.
it's just kind of funny how children become empowered with the notion. So inevitably, clients come and say, how do I even tell them that this person exists, much less what their role is? So it's super important for them to educate themselves on the exact role that the attorney has, whether it's GAL or child's representative. I wanted to make sure from a listener standpoint that this is an Illinois practice. And I said the collar counties in Chicagoland because it's very different all around the globe. I'm on the international board for AFCC, and it's been great learning to see what other countries, much less states, are doing. So it's very important that people know that the current practice here is very, very different than even downstate Illinois. There's law as it relates to each of these roles, but the practice is very different. In a lot of jurisdictions, GALs are not lawyers. So you just have to be super careful on that person's role. And there are differences as it relates to confidentiality.
Right.
And you and I talked about having a whole podcast on this topic. And in either role, the therapists are often interviewed by this person and trying to get any collateral witness information, because everybody in the divorce is of course going to be reporting as self-serving, right? Like, so, obviously the parents, the grandparents, the siblings, the aunts, the uncles, everybody has their agenda. So a lot of times we interview therapists, coaches, teachers. Often it's important to hear from them because in theory, they're supposed to be objective. I'm in a case right now where I'm a GAL and I'm helping. The term we often use is we're the eyes and ears of the court. So in that case, I'm helping this family on a relocation matter. That's when people have to ask for permission to move out of state with the child. And
so tricky when you have two parents in one, they have to be able to somehow visit both.
Yes. So all of those witnesses in those interviews, it's been fascinating to hear. They're not supposed to align, but they're aligning with one parent or the other.
Right.
And it's been really interesting to hear. And then I have to kind of weigh whether I trust their opinions or, assess credibility and what is their role in this? Are they being objective? So it's an interesting role. A lot of people think the judge does whatever the GAL wants or the child's representative, and that's just not the case.
Right. Right. And just to clarify, Beth, it's not like every person who's going through a divorce will even have a GAL or a child representative, right? So what kind of situations would merit that?
No, that's a great question. It's actually pretty rare, God willing, that it gets to the place where a GAL or a child's representative is needed. Even if a case is in litigation, meaning in the court system, probably a good 80% of them do not involve a GAL, maybe higher. There's no real numbers, by the way. When people say there's numbers, there's not, because there's no way to say.
So in thinking about, the different ways that parents can divorce, again, if they're just starting to contemplate this for themselves, can you kind of, again, give a Cliff Notes version of mediation, collaborative law, litigation, and just some quick pros and cons about each? I know there's not a one size fits all.
Right. So the other approach other than litigation, ADR is short for alternative dispute resolution. And under that falls mediation, collaborative law, and arbitration. Again, I'll talk from a local practice standpoint. We aren't using arbitration that much. So I'll go with that one first, just very quickly. It's basically a private trial where your arbitrator is named by agreement by the couple. and that person is the decision maker rather than a judge. There's very distinct roles, defined roles, and again, it's not often used locally. Next up is mediation. And in mediation, you have an independent third party acting as a facilitator, not giving any recommendations in theory, and not advising as to the law. They're simply hearing each person and kind of keeping them in the rails and guiding them along to resolution. As it relates to parenting issues, I often am very thoughtful in what role the mediator might have. There are mediators who are lawyers, mental health professionals, financial professionals. So, in parenting issues, of course, ideally, in my mind, it would be a therapist mediator. If not, it would be a lawyer mediator who's child centered and trained as a GAL or child's representative.
Right.
But under mediation, though, there is mediation with just the couple, and then there's mediation that's attorney assisted. Again, locally in practice, we have a lot of attorney assisted mediation. On parenting issues, sometimes it's not as crucial because they're so emotionally fraught that, usually the couple has a lot of things to talk through, and they should probably not be having lawyers. They don't need that. But then there are people who don't feel that there's a balance of power in the decision making and that they need to have their lawyer there as an advocate.
Right. I could see all the pros and cons.
Yeah, exactly. And then the last role is or process is collaborative law. And I finish with that because every professional team member in a collaborative law case is a trained mediator. So remember, we talked about all the different roles you can fill. There are two lawyers. Every person has a lawyer. So there's one for the husband, one for the wife. And then there's a financial neutral, and they're trained as a CPA, CDFA. There's a lot of designations. And then there's a coach or coaches. There's a one coach model and a two coach model. Lawyers tend to defer to the coaches as to whether they think it's appropriate for one or two coaches. In practice, we tend to use one coach for obvious reasons. You don't want the us against them kind of mentality. The coach staying neutral can be helpful. There are instances where you just simply can't do that. It's too much for the coach to handle. Certainly if there's mental health issues, sometimes if there's a betrayal, sometimes if there's addiction issues, there's just too much information to hold neutrally, and the people need to have their place to give the information to. The most important distinction as it relates to collaborative law, one of which is legal, the other is emotional. The emotional difference that can be challenging for some people when collaborative law is done right, the people are doing all the talking. The lawyers are not advocating because we are signing what's called a participation agreement. And in that role, we have a unique ability to reach across the aisle and think of the other person. That's, again, most lawyers don't understand it. But in that role, I'm not just the advocate for my client, I'm the advocate for the family and holding the family redefined and holding space for them to find the solution.
Yeah.
It's most lawyers don't understand that we have to have what's called limited scope representation so that we are able to do that without betraying the concept of advocacy for our client. So the biggest legal difference is if they don't reach terms in collaborative, they have to start over with all new lawyers. And inevitably, clients just turn it away and say they can't for that reason until the lawyer, God willing, properly helps them understand the value of it, is that we all have skin in the game. They have the answer between themselves. They need to come up with the answer. there's no judge on the planet who knows more about this family than they do.
Right.
So the more you help them understand that keeping control over the outcome.
I was just going to say they gain some sort of control versus letting a judge decide their fate.
They have complete control in any form of ADR.
Yeah.
People often say, well, the judge might not approve it. Judges approve, certainly if you have lawyers who know what they're doing.
Right.
The judges will approve it.
Right.
Unless it's way out of bounds. I'll give an example there. A couple of things. On the financial side, I have cases where we had a case where 100% of the assets went to one side, and in exchange for what's called a maintenance waiver, alimony. So it seems ridiculous. How could that ever happen? Well, once the parties were able to speak about each of their goals and each of their concerns, in this case, the wife got all the assets, which were ginormous, but the husband made an income well in excess of $5 million. So he could recoup the assets and never have to share it. And he was basically betting on himself. Again, ridiculous on its face. The judge had a lot of questions, and the financial neutral was there to back up all the decisions, and everything had been fully vetted by a team. So it really does help to have a team concept.
Definitely.
On the parenting side, a lot of people think it's the default to 50-50 parenting. Well, that's not necessarily true. A judge needs to know what's in the child's best interest. So you can try on different parenting schedules in a collaborative process without anybody posturing on, oh, well, that's going to be the way it is if we did 50-50. Well, if you tried 50-50 and the kids are thriving and both people agree, there's an answer.
Right.
But if 50-50 is too challenging and it's hard on the kids to go back and forth,
right,
50 is maybe not the answer. Then the big challenge is, what do we do? What do we try on another schedule? How do we decide if it's slanted one way or the other? And that's where the coach comes in. There's a last role called parenting specialist that, as a last resort, we often use, where that person actually interviews the children and maybe looks like and feels like a GAL in litigation. But in this role, it is always a mental health professional. And they're very soft and trained to just hear what the child thinks.
Mm-hmm.
This is an important distinction that most people don't understand. In training as a GAL, as a child's representative, a child specialist in the collaborative role, we never ask kids what they want specifically as it relates to, do you want to live with mom? Do you want to live with dad? You know that, Lee, but the public kind of thinks we just go and we ask the kid.
Well, and unfortunately, some of the parents are trying to prepare the kids for this very, question that they think is going to be asked. And these poor kids are rehearsing. And, can you imagine the guilt if later they think that they were responsible for some decision that would not be appropriate for a child to make?
And the stories I could tell you of, it's so obvious. Parents think they're going to be the ones who get away with it. Mm-hmm. Well, kids are great because they, we do talk about the importance of telling the truth, et cetera. But, I have a great story of going to a playground. A good GAL goes and meets kids where they're comfortable, right? So I walk on the playground, and I took my daughter with me when she was younger. Because again, I just want it to feel like a play date kind of thing. We're hanging out. All I want to know is who they are,
Yeah.
And this little girl climbs up to the top of the jungle gym, and her mom introduces me, and she says, I want to live with my mom. I never want to see my dad again. Before she said hello. And that was a perfect tone for me to be like, okay, so this is what this might be. And of course, it had played out that ultimately mom was the greater challenge. So,
yeah. Oh my goodness. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, kind of switching gears a little bit, again, if you had, parents listening who are, they're going to start the process, they haven't yet, what would you coach them in terms of having that very important initial conversation with their own kids, just explaining that they are going to get a divorce?
Well, first of all, I say God willing, they have therapists themselves and lean on you or that being the child's therapist or your own therapist because they have the best information. I always tell clients that they have to rehearse it. Ideally, they will have worked on it together. Just this week, I had a woman tell me that the husband blurted it out almost as if, what are we having for dinner? Literally, she said, not even sitting down, kind of on the run and saying, this isn't your fault. It's only mom and I are going to figure it out. We'll let you know what's happening. And kind of literally walking through the room. Well, you and I talked about we have kids who have come back and told us that this day impacted them much like 9/11 impacts us as humans, that they have never forgotten what the words were that dad said. They have never forgotten what mom's face looked like, the details that they recall of that moment. So if everyone stops and pauses and thinks about that feedback before you tell your child, of course you should rehearse it. Of course it's awkward.
Right.
And inevitably, those people who rehearse it, it never goes the way that you want it to. That's life, right? If it was a rehearsal, please. So inevitably, clients have shared that, the teenage girl that they expect to go off the rails is not only not going off the rails, she was the calm one, but they expected this child who was the calm one to stay calm, and he's the one who lost it. So the stories are endless and tragic. So much thought should be going into this with families, and it's just not.
I also think, sometimes parents don't realize until you explicitly say, it's really ideal if both of you can be having this conversation, agreeing about the terminology you're using and what you're exactly sharing or not sharing, and still, like you said, sometimes one parent says, nope, I got this and I'm going to do it myself. And so just the idea that the children and the parents are together having that conversation together, and it may not be one conversation, right? It may be a series of conversations, but I agree. I think that more emphasis should go on the importance of how they share it, at least at first, knowing that it's going to evolve and be more conversation as time goes on.
It should definitely be joint. And any parent, again, if you're GAL and you're making recommendations, any parent who does that unilaterally without at least telling the parent, again, that's really cruel. That's a level of cruel that tells a lot about them as an individual, and that they're not being child-centered in any of their decisions.
Right. And a lot of this sets the tone, for the rest of the process, because we know, many, many families get divorced, right? Many parents get divorced, and some of the kids really do. It's always very difficult at first, but many kids are just fine, in terms of their resiliency, and others really suffer, from the psychological effects. But I said it's really about how the parents handle it and what it looks like. It's not just divorce in and of itself.
No, 100%. Bill Emery's book, One Childhood, Two Homes, I hope I didn't butcher it. But the basic concept that you as a clinician and those of us who work child-centered just tell parents the only thing that affects the outcome of this child is your ability to get along. And to the extent you can fake it, like literally anything you can do. As a divorced mom myself, I can tell you I am forever refocusing on the positives and building dad up, because kids kind of innately like to split. We all did it, right? We work parents in an intact household just the same.
Right.
And we're just giving them more opportunity to do that. So the more parents can align, and inevitably, when you're doing these investigations, you'll be like, hey, if I'm interviewing mom, I'll say, can you give me 3 things positive about dad? Nope. Right?
I married him,
Like,
but I can't think of one. Right.
I procreated. These beautiful children are ours, and I can't come up with one thing.
Oh,
No, he's got nice blue eyes. That's just heartbreaking. And that's when we start talking about doing some mandated counseling. And
right. And the kids are half mom, half dad. They know it, right? So when mom badmouths dad or vice versa, it's like they feel like there's a part of themselves being attacked, like part of me is no good. Part of me is evil, or whatever words the parents are
the
using.
exact feedback these children who've grown up, they've come back and told us that. That's what they hear. If you're going to bash mom, all they hear is you're bashing me. Her blood pulses through my veins just like yours does. So
Right.
people don't stop and think about it. It's like
Right.
we teach them they can't talk mean about other people because that reflects badly upon you. But yet you're doing that. Like, it's
Right.
hard.
And you're sending them to live with that other parent half of the time, presumably, or whatever portion of the time. So like if they're evil or they're, no good in some way, that's a hard recipe for success for that child to go to that parent's house.
Right? Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's just all too common. I was telling you offline, as a GAL, it's so humbling to talk to these kids and the stories. I know exactly where they sat, and
Mm.
I never forget these kids. It's kind of it. Anyway, I've had several come back. I think I'm up to 5 now, and they've gone to law school themselves because they want to be advocates for children.
Amazing.
But that's positive on one hand. The other hand is, are you kidding me? That's the trajectory of their life. So
Right.
those parents who question that whether this impacts their children, pause and think about that.
Right. Right.
That's their memory. Why can't it be their memory to play baseball and, go to a slumber party?
Right.
And,
Right. No, it's like branded in their brains. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
So what other, I guess nuggets can you share and thinking about, stories of families you've worked with, either that have been really successful that you want to share and kind of why, or pitfalls that we, again, listeners can avoid.
Yeah.
I know you've
So
seen it
I'll
all.
Yes, a colleague and I, Jason Sposeep, I don't know, he practices similar to me in a thoughtful way, and is constantly coming up with creative solutions on how to help couples divorce.
Mhm.
And then when we actually do it together, how creative we can be. And we were preparing our own presentation on a story on how an obvious litigation case, meaning the couple's going to be fighting, turned into a collaborative case, and we were able to get super creative. So, in this case, the mother had a serious addiction issue, alcohol. And the daughter was old enough to understand it, unfortunately, but of course, fortunately, on some level. So, around 9 or 10 is when the divorce started. And he divorced simply to keep the daughter safe because he wasn't able to figure it out. Well, with this team based approach, we were able to come up with creative solutions, and having her meet with a therapist who was able to report for her what, if anything, she was feeling as far as her own safety. Lots of protocols put in place, a parenting schedule that was going to be gradual so that confidence could be built, sobriety could be determined. There were all kinds of safeguards in place.
Mhm.
In court, I often say you're divorcing with a machete instead of a scalpel.
Mm.
And the only other obvious solution in court would have been to get an order of protection, and
Right.
mom having supervised parenting time, or maybe even only therapeutic. And it's just ghastly when you think about the marked difference. And the outcome is beautiful. The parents still talk and work together for this now adolescent. And, you know, she's safe.
Mhm.
Mom constantly is working on her sobriety. She's still not. But the tools are in place to help them because the divorce was going to happen either way.
Mhm.
In sharp contrast, if that was in court, it would be an order of protection. And back to what the daughter's memory of her childhood would be, she didn't have a voice. She may have been interviewed by a GAL for a half an hour here or
Mhm.
there, but in that process, she was able to have a constant voice. She had check ins I think initially weekly and then monthly.
And a relationship with mom, because I've also seen where the mom is just cut off completely, deemed unfit, and the child doesn't have any contact with the mother, which is also, not great.
No, because fostering a relationship, even with bad parents.
Right. I mean, it's still her mom.
Exactly. And if it is too dangerous, of course, you've got to have therapy in place to help process that. Hopefully, we don't have listeners who are dealing with that level of extreme, but there's a lot in between those two.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, it sounds like, you have so much more control with the collaborative model and with mediation to kind of figure out what works best, for your own family, and still, not have it be like a gamble, what's going to happen in court.
Right.
Yeah. So that sounds very successful. What are some pitfalls to avoid? When have you seen things go sour?
So I think it's important for parents to see that pitfall of prepping and thinking they're going to outsmart the system, so to speak. And those people who are doing the evaluations might not see that their child is being coached, or that because it is obvious to those of us who are in the industry, we know, and that's inevitably going to come back and bite that parent. So they can say, well, all I was doing was preparing her. Any parent would do that. You prepare her to go to the doctor, you prepare. So I get the concept, but you also know that this is an extreme. So just get yourself in check. So be super careful on that. The other thing that people often say is, well, I didn't say anything bad about dad to her. I was just talking to my girlfriend on the phone.
Right. Gabbing loudly on the phone. Right.
And they do know.
Of course.
And back to that concept of his blood pulses through his veins too, right? So you got to just be super mindful, and instructing other family members, grandma and grandpa, aunts and uncles, everybody, just always talk nicely.
Right.
Because they can do a lot of damage as well.
Makes sense. I remember the phrase, love your child more than you hate your spouse. Not that we're saying we want you to hate your spouse, right? If you can get to a therapeutic place, like you said, truly in your own therapy of forgiveness, acceptance, whatever, that's the first choice. But like you said, if not, fake it till you make it, right? You still have to try to do the right thing for your child. And like you said, the grandparents as well, the aunts and uncles, the friends who come over, everyone, because again, you're hurting your child so much when you're bad mouthing and gaslighting and all this kind of stuff. So,
and then the opposite of that, of course, is to actually foster the relationship and watch your child light up when you say something positive.
Right.
And when you ask questions that are sweet about how things went, rather than interrogating them after a visit.
Right. So how is the visit with a smile and wanting to genuinely hear is different than, you didn't have any fun, did you? Did he do this thing again that he always does?
Well, that, or, tell me the 3 best things you did this weekend. And it doesn't have to be about dad or mom.
Right.
What was your favorite part?
Because some kids will learn to not talk at all about their visit to the other parent, because they know that the other parent really doesn't want to hear or doesn't approve. Or if they had fun, they have to say they had a terrible time. So it's invalidating to their actual positive experience if they did have fun. And if they didn't, you hope that the other parent is helping foster a better, relationship or a better experience the next visit. Because again, Right. But it's true. It's much harder if the parents are not in their own therapy, if they're not able to get to a place where they're at peace, because of course we know divorce is a very difficult experience on adults. It's not easy. What we're asking them to do it's not necessarily easy or natural for anyone. They are angry. They do have feelings, to process.
Yeah. So true.
Yeah. What kind of software, Beth, have you seen help in the divorce process? I just remember the one, like the Family Wizard, I think it was called, but I mean, that was years ago. I'm curious if there's anything currently that is helpful to families as they divorce in terms of communication or parenting schedules, anything like that.
Yeah, everybody's different as far as what platform. Our Family Wizard is still the gold standard.
Okay.
And they've done great in keeping up with trends, et cetera. So that's
Can you
smart.
explain a little bit about how that all works?
Yeah, well, the good news and bad news about it, it is a platform that's easily discoverable. Those who are in the divorce process know that, everybody's going to see who said what. So it's kind of a babysitter as far as communication skills.
So instead of texting or emailing, you're using this platform.
Only, a lot of court orders say nothing else can happen. So, you've got a microscope on you in a divorce period. You add this component. And so a lot of times GALs have ability to log on as well. So we're actually literally watching it, the discussion. And then, yes, there's shared calendars, there's shared financial information. It's as good as it gets. In the perfect world, this family would never need it.
Right.
You just have a group family thread.
Right. So it's reserved for more contentious divorces where, the spouses cannot just text each other or email each other because there's so much angst that happens in there. But like you said, if they are texting horrible things to each other, and you say you're no longer allowed to communicate that, you have to do it through this family wizard, they're going to be on their best behavior, essentially.
In theory.
In theory. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Yeah. So, and for those who don't need that level of supervision, what would you say in terms of just communication, manners 101? What would you say to parents as they're co-parenting?
Just there's some funny memes about text like it's going to be read in court one day, right? Like you just really have to be smart because you are under the microscope. But best practice, I tell parents for the older kids, put them on the family thread, talk to one another, just like, you want to be spoken to. Golden rule stuff. It's embarrassing that you feel like you have to tell people that. There's also, I've been on group threads with parents as a GAL. So they're kind of, I'm watching over, and that kind of keeps them on their best behavior.
Right.
Another role that I didn't touch upon that's used in litigation, the concept of parenting coordinator. That's a whole different role. But a lot of times judges use parenting coordinators to help families who are in super high conflict and keep them out of their courtroom. So they're dealing with some of the smaller stuff.
Right. Like if someone wants a different day of vacation and they want to swap, but the parents aren't able to work that out themselves, would that be a parent communication coordinator type thing?
That's a perfect example. And then even, Halloween costumes. And I mean, the stuff that you can't imagine people fight about.
Yeah.
Sometimes you feel like just to fight, but it's sad.
It is sad.
The parenting coordinator role is one that is, it's so challenging that there are people who only do it and that they have the thick skin for it. I personally do it sometimes only for very complex families. You have to give a lot of attention. And in the perfect world, you're doing that with phone calls, et cetera. Sometimes there's so high conflict, you only do text. It's wild.
Yeah.
Real quickly, back to the software.
Yeah.
SoberLink is another thing that people forget about. But if alcohol addiction is at issue, super important tool. Again, just because someone has an addiction issue doesn't necessarily mean they're a bad parent. And we can keep kids safe while still allowing that relationship to flourish.
So that would allow the other parent without the addiction problem to make sure child's not getting in the car with the parent who might be drinking. Is that correct?
In the car, or even be with them. There's safety protocols where, they can just ask on demand to blow and then everybody can see it.
Yeah.
I think we've come a long way that way. And again, ideally you do it without shame. It's just, these are facts. And the addict will recognize that and do whatever they have to do in order to make everyone feel confident.
Well, and the truth is it's a wonderful tool because not only is there the physical safety piece, that's where my brain went to the driving, but, I've worked with kids where they say, mom acts in a crazy way. She starts raging or screaming, when she even has, however much to drink. and they don't want to be around her at all. Right. And so it's like, how do you tell? Because sometimes that person can pass, like they're good. They're good to go. They grab the kid from the driveway. And so, but if the child can sense the differences, that would be a good way to just kind of help that child avoid ever being with that parent when they're drinking.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And, oh, well, it's just so low that, well, no. And then let's say they blow safe on Friday night. Well, that doesn't make the other parent feel any better that, Friday at 11:30 at night that they're still not drinking. So
Right.
that's why all kinds of protocols and
Absolutely.
safeguards.
Okay. No, that's super helpful. My last kind of couple questions are just about if there's same thing about books or resources for the parents primarily.
I have a whole bibliography that I don't remember it offhand.
I just remember the Good Karma divorce from again, I read it a long time ago, but are there any other, just one or two that stick out or that are really gold standards?
So the gold standards, I mean, literally, thank goodness more and more people have written on the topic of the importance of staying out of court.
Mm-hmm.
So I would just, literally, I probably see a launch every week of somebody who has written a book. So that's the good news. We won't even talk about artificial intelligence and oh my gosh, the information you can find is unbelievable. But Bill Emery, of course, comes to mind as the gold standard on, if you read nothing else as a divorcing parent, reading that book is, to me, the best.
Okay.
And then as far as the kiddos to read, all the grief books, I feel like all too often parents think it only applies to children whose parents have passed or have lost. So thankfully, Lee wrote a book. I still give that book out, Lee. I haven't told you that in a long time.
That's so sweet.
Yeah, it's great. And you signed them for me. I still have them. So anyway, that's great. And then I also have to push for Rainbows for All Children. I don't know if you've there still, but I'm on the advisory council there. And that program, the stories of facilitators who tell me the kids who come out of it and how much they help each other. I just love that as a peer support group.
That's wonderful. Yes. No, that's super helpful. And when you said about the books about grief and loss, I'm thinking about The Invisible String is for young kids, but it's a beautiful story. And, the concept of, yes, our family is going through this big shift, this big change, and the parents are now in two homes, but I love you and I'm connected to you, child, wherever you are. So if you're at dad's house or mom's house, the idea that we're all connected to those we love, and it works if someone has some separation anxiety at first, but the concept is beautiful and it applies to of course, grief and loss as well. But this is a loss, right? The intact family, it is like a death. And so it makes sense that those books are also really appropriate. Yeah. Yeah.
Thankfully, there's more and more resources every day. And again, Rainbows and other programs where it doesn't normalize it, but it helps them realize they're not alone and that these peers have all kinds of tools to share with one another about what it feels like to have a bag and be that kid who has to take their suitcase. Those are some sad stories, but anyway.
Yeah. I was going to say, I'm going to give one last nugget that just came to mind as you were talking, and then we'll wrap up. But, for the people who can afford it, of course, this is not going to be true for everyone. I always think about how parents can have sort of the different supplies at each house so that the kid, like you said, isn't dragging that bag back and forth. That imagery popped out. So gym shoes at mom's house and dad's house, the thick math book, So again, I'm not saying that they're going to have, whatever expensive, equipment at both houses, but the things that they really can handle in terms of the finances and that kids really do need, because the amount of fights that parents get into about, you forgot the this and you forgot the that, and the amount of pressure that the kids feel, especially if they're not super organized, good with executive functioning, it's a huge burden. And so if it's something little like that can just make their lives easier as they start, acclimating and adjusting, of course, like you would hope that they could do that. So that was a little bit of advice I wanted to share.
It's so true.
Good. Well, thank you, Beth, so much for being here today. You have always been such an incredible, resource and mentor and role model. And you do such incredible work for everyone you've ever worked with. So again, thank you for your time.
It's an honor, Lee. I love that you're doing this. An incredible resource for those parents who feel all alone. They can tune in and learn all kinds of tips from you.
Thank you. I hope so. And everyone who's listening, check out more episodes of our podcast. Go to copingpartners.com and click on podcast and articles. And thank you as always for tuning in.
Thank you for listening to the Coping Podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes. And check out our podcast page at copingpartners.com.